Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
2024 certainly had its share of ups and downs, and most economists will tell you that things probably played out better than expected in the Canadian economy. So does this tell us anything about 2025? Maybe. I'm Kris McCusker, and today on The Big Story, we speak to two lead writers at NerdWallet Canada who are highlighting 4 financial trends which could shape next year. Shannon Terrell and Clay Jarvis join us now. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Yeah, anytime.
So first, let's set the scene for our listeners. How do you view the landscape going into 2025?
I think the big thing that a lot of folks are talking about right now is just concern generally over what's going to happen to the broader economy moving into 2025. And there are just a lot of variables at play. So one of the major predictions here is that Canada is going to lead the G7 in economic growth, which is exciting. But what does this mean for the everyday Canadian? Well, as inflation is continuing to ride below the 3% threshold, as the Bank of Canada continues to lower interest rates, this is going to translate into more affordable mortgages, better loan terms, and hopefully some breathing room in people's budgets. However, we are now contending with a labor market that is starting to feel some strain. And we are still continuing to deal with the general cost of living crisis here in Canada. So while there are things to look forward to, there are some things that are going to be cause for concern that folks should probably keep an eye on into the coming year.
Some believe that we're in a recession and that, immigration numbers are maybe propping the numbers up a little bit, and that is likely to change next year.
That's certainly something I've been looking at. Just the prospect of lower economic growth because of some of the changes that have happened since we rolled out our predictions in October. Lower immigration targets, smaller international student numbers, Trump's tariff threats. Like all of these things could really have a negative impact on GDP growth next year. And not just to the point where, we're talking about in the news, but where people really feel it at a personal level. Job losses, falling behind on your mortgages. These could be real threats if the, most negative scenarios come to pass.
Well, and the Bank of Canada, ended the year with an interest rate cut in part because the unemployment rate was at its highest level since 2017. So that's not going to change overnight.
Yes, it's a bit of a mixed bag right now, and hopefully we're going to see more stability into the new year as we hopefully get additional policy interest rate cuts. But yes, the general increase in unemployment, it's being attributed to a few different things right now. We have an influx of individuals who are entering the workforce. It translated into more people seeking employment. We saw some sluggish wage growth in November, but ultimately, this rate cut we saw from the Bank of Canada, I think this is going to be really integral in the coming months to hopefully help stimulate a bit more growth for the labor market. And as Clay mentions, we also have these potentially pending tariffs, which could have a huge impact on our economy going forward. So a lot of speculation right now, and there's just so much that's up in the air.
Yeah, and the thing about the tariffs in particular is that no one really knows at this point if that's going to happen, if that's a negotiating tactic. How do you plan for something that may or may not play out?
Yeah, you can't really plan for something that doesn't play out. I think, in times like this, when there's uncertainty hanging over the economy or over your own personal finances, the advice we usually give is make sure that your emergency fund is in good shape. And I mean, putting extra money aside today when things are so expensive, when you're doing your Christmas shopping, it's really unrealistic. But if you think there's a chance that your income might be disrupted, the best thing you can do for yourself and your household is to make sure that you have a little bit of a cushion there just in case.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. In addition to the emergency fund, I think it's a great time for folks to also really prioritize paying down high interest debt, especially credit card debt. Now may be the time to really develop your pay down strategy. And we don't necessarily want to wait for 2025. Maybe this is something we want to think about now. So 2 major options for folks in that position would be a debt consolidation loan or a balance transfer credit card. Both can be options. We can start getting the ball rolling today. We don't have to wait. we can start to prioritize the high interest debt and set ourselves up for a stronger financial position into 2025.
And what I'd also throw in there as an option, I don't know if either of you do this, but what I do, I use my line of credit exclusively for paying down my credit card because the interest rate is so much lower. If I end up going on a trip or I make a purchase where my credit card debt is a little higher than normal, I just swing that over to my line of credit and then pay that down as I'm comfortable with, just because the interest rate is so much lower. And with the Bank of Canada cutting interest rates, the rates on those lines of credit are coming down too. So it becomes a more affordable option with every Bank of Canada rate cut.
Yeah, we were going to talk about credit cards. Shannon, is there anything else you wanted to add to that? I mean, Canada has always, even before the pandemic, has long been one of the most indebted nations in the world.
Yeah. So, according to recent survey data from NerdWallet, we found credit card debt among Canadian adults has jumped from 43% to 55%. And this isn't just short-term debt we're talking about. Over half of the people carrying credit card debt are looking at 6 months or more to pay it off. So, as Clay mentions, lowered interest rates are going to potentially encourage folks to maybe consider leaning into those options where we do see interest rates impacted by changes to our policy interest rates, to the prime rate. Credit cards, unfortunately, aren't one of those products that are impacted by these changes. And the standard credit card rate in Canada is about 20%. So again, it's just so important for folks, especially as we enter this holiday shopping season and potentially put a little more on our credit cards, is to just have a really effective strategy in place come the new year to start tackling that debt.
Speaking of credit cards, Clay, you're seeing trends that maybe suggest Canadians might be working to better their financial situations.
So we see in the third quarter of 2024 that the household savings rate in Canada is at its highest level since the tail end of the pandemic. And so what that signals to me is that people are either exhausted, they're either broke, or they're going to prioritize paying down their debt or maybe making a major purchase later in the year. And of those four options, paying down debt, I really hope that that is going to be the priority, because if people can get control of their debt in the first quarter or second quarter of 2024, then that kind of frees them up to spend over the summer, over the latter part of the year, which might help us avoid a more serious recession.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? I mean, there have been at times, I'm going to say over the last maybe 20 years, where consumers have been a big part of the economy.
Oh, yeah. If people aren't spending, our economy doesn't really grow. And that goes from day-to-day spending, but also bigger spending on cars, on homes. So if people aren't confident in making those purchases, then it's really hard for GDP to pick up some momentum in 2025.
We also touched on the, tariff threat from the U.S. as well. I guess that potentially throws a wrench into any consumer spending going forward, depending on how that plays out.
Absolutely. I've seen estimates where a trade war between the U.S. and Canada based on tariffs could lead to between 150,000 and an absolute worst case scenario, 500,000 job losses. So this would just be an absolute calamity for the economy. Now, obviously, this is not something people need to start planning for yet, but it does kind of give some perspective to just how important this trade relationship is with the States.
Well, and I've also spoken to economists that, potentially, if the U.S. were to put the tariffs in place and then Canada were to retaliate, that could be inflationary. So we spent all this time beating inflation back, only to potentially see it move higher again. Possibly.
Absolutely. And then you're seeing higher prices at a time when unemployment might be rising, or unemployment rising at a time when people need to renew their mortgages. So it would just be a cascading fountain of disasters if this were to come to pass.
The other thing, I guess, that's going to be really interesting going forward is the real estate market. We did have those 5 interest rate cuts this year, and how do you see that playing out?
Well, October and November were pretty busy. We saw some massive year-over-year spikes in sales in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, which is all very encouraging. But I have been speaking to different agents across the country, and people do still have some hesitation with getting into a home purchase. They're getting pre-qualified, they're getting pre-approved, they're looking at properties. But then when it comes time to pull the trigger, some of them are getting cold feet. And I think a lot of that really does have to do with uncertainty uncertainty over, what's my job going to be like in 6 months? What's this home going to be worth in 6 months? Will I be able to carry negative equity? So I think that people are worried, but at the same time, Canadians don't really worry about macroeconomic threats when they're buying homes. So we see during the pandemic, massive recession going on, but yet people are going out and buying up houses like they've never done it before. So even though there are some anxieties around the economy right now, if rates keep going down, people are going to see it as an opportunity to get into a home, and they're going to do it.
Shannon, do you have anything to add to that? I guess, the interest rate story going forward is going to play into real estate as well.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it continues to be a highly inaccessible market for first-time home buyers. And so really, I mean, the name of the game right now is this is highly speculative. There's a lot at play. We're talking about the interest rate changes, the potential tariffs being imposed. We're talking about potential inflation coming back if said tariffs are imposed. And so I think, honestly, the bottom line for people here is just to sort of keep the focus on the things that you can control as far as your finances are concerned. We've touched on emergency savings. We've touched on high interest debt. Another effective strategy is automating your savings. Every dollar counts, and just sort of we're going to have to play this by ear in the coming months to really see the full impact of these policy interest rate changes and potentially the developing situation with the U.S.
It feels a little bit as we go into 2025 that there are maybe more unknowns, or maybe it's just me. Does it feel that way to you as well, that just both of you, what you watch closely, that maybe there's a little more uncertainty now than there have been in years past, which is saying something given the last couple of years we have seen?
I would agree with that. It does feel like there are more unknowns right now. I think especially given the recent U.S. election and all of the headlines that has created, and the potential 25% tariffs that are going to be imposed and what that means for us, for our economy. Things were looking strong for us into 2025, but now we have recent labor report numbers, and we have inflation data and CPI data that is a little discouraging. And ultimately, I think what's important for people to keep in mind is while inflation has come down from those record-breaking rates that we saw throughout the pandemic, there's no reason that it can't rise again under the right or perhaps wrong circumstances. And we've already been dealing with immense pressure under our cost of living. As inflation has come down, it doesn't mean that prices have been coming down. From January 2021 to about August of 2024, headline inflation actually rose by 17%. And that was a rise equal to the 10 years prior to 2021. So to put that in perspective, that's about a decade's worth of inflation in just 3.5 years. So to answer your question, there are a lot of unknowns. We have been under a lot of pressure, and I think a lot could really change in the coming months.
It's really easy to be skeptical, and it's easy to even be cynical about the coming year because we haven't received much good news lately. Aside from the housing market bouncing back in October and November, most of the data we're getting is pretty negative. Per capita GDP growth, really sad. Overall GDP growth coming in below projections. Unemployment, it's just everything seems to be piling up into just a mountain of challenges that we're going to have to find some way to get around next year. But just like Shannon said, just because we're speculating in a negative way, it doesn't mean that all of these things are going to come to pass. And you can't start treating your finances like the sky is falling. So, maintain the course. If you've had a steady job and you feel good about where your employment's going to be, you don't need to freak out. If you have some money set aside, you maybe don't have to worry too much.
It seems to me as well, you guys have outlined some really great strategies that maybe more so than ever, those sorts of things need to be utilized.
Yes, that's exactly right, too. And I love Clay's point about, we can't treat our finances like the sky is falling, because there are lots of tangible, practical things that we can do in our day-to-day lives to help us save money, to cut back on debt. The cost of essentials has risen, but that doesn't mean we can't take actionable steps and spend strategically. So, for groceries, maybe we want to consider food rescue apps, price matching, couponing apps for general expenses. Maybe we want to conduct a subscription audit to help prune out those unnecessary ongoing fees for services that we don't use. And hey, maybe now is also a great time to reevaluate your credit card. You want to make sure that your credit card's rates, fees, and rewards are continuing to align with your spending habits and your financial goals. And if those financial circumstances have changed or your spending habits have changed, hey, maybe now is the time to reevaluate so that you can make sure you have a card in your wallet that really aligns with your current financial situation and sets you up for success in the year to come.
Yeah, I'd also recommend that people just take a look at your actual spending habits and are they responsible? Like, are you taking part in lifestyle spending or doom spending that you know isn't necessarily going to make you happy in the long run? Is this going to add to your credit card debt? Really evaluate what you need, purchase by purchase by purchase, because I know I'm not the only one who does it. I know my significant other and our friends aren't the only people who are doing it. So you really have to take a look at your spending habits and make sure that they align with your financial goals, because I think for a lot of us, they do not.
And that's a perfect place to stop. Clay Jarvis and Shannon Terrell, both lead writers at NerdWallet Canada. You can find more tips and strategies at nerdwallet.com/ca. That wraps up this edition of the Big Story Podcast. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.